The Anderson Language and Technology Center at CU Boulder is committed to broadening and deepening cultural understanding. Alltech offers non-credit language classes in person and remotely to everyone year-round. Our flexible and engaging format makes language learning a breeze for anyone. The Anderson Language and Technology Center at CU motivated students broadening and passionate about traveling and experiencing the world. Alltech offers non-credit language classes in person and remotely to everyone year-round. The Anderson Language and Technology Center at CU Boulder is committed to broadening and deepening cultural understanding. Alltech offers non-credit language classes in person and remotely to everyone year-round. Our flexible and engaging format makes language learning a breeze for anyone. So join a community of like-minded and motivated students who are passionate about traveling and experiencing the world. Jump into our summer session with a 20% discount using the code ALLTECHFUN. Learn more at alltech.colorado.edu.
Hi, my name is Daniel Rohrbacher. I'm a senior studying International Affairs and Political Science and the Student Committee Co-Chair. With this year's more unorthodox conference, one collective goal we had was to think outside the box in terms of the types of panels and events that we produced. One way we achieved this goal was by looking inwards towards CU itself. Working with Professor Don Grant, we were able to showcase how his students compete each year in the Map the System competition. There are a myriad of challenges that face our generation today, which require complex and profound solutions. The Map the System competition allows students to gain an in-depth understanding of pressing social and environmental problems and allows students to develop feasible and effective solutions to these issues. This event will showcase the talents of our fellow students, which will hopefully be on display for many more conferences to come. Thank you and enjoy the event.
Good evening, everyone. Good evening. My name is Don Grant. I am a professor of sociology here at CU Boulder and the director of the university's program in social innovation. As mentioned in the video you just saw, tonight's session is part of a larger international contest organized by the University of Oxford called Map the System 2021.
Hi, I'm Dr. Peter Drobak, Director of the Skoll Center for Social Entrepreneurship at the University of Oxford. Welcome to Map the System 2021. We're absolutely thrilled to have 64 universities on 6 continents participating in Map the System this year, by far our biggest year yet. By the way, Antarctica, what are you waiting for? You're all part of a global learning community that wants to use systems change as a superpower for transformational social and environmental change. And I feel like Map the System was really made for the moment that we're in right now, when we're living through these entangled systemic crises, what Bill Gates called mutually exacerbating catastrophes. And so this year, our goal is to leverage the creativity and intellectual firepower of our global Map the System community to develop actionable systemic change ideas that can help us to respond to a world in crisis.
And so, as mentioned in the video, tonight's contest is one of 64 going on at various college campuses throughout the world, and the winners of each will go on to participate in the global competition. Now, importantly, this contest is about demonstrating students' understanding, their understanding of the underlying systems that perpetuate a social problem. Unlike other competitions, therefore, the focus here is not on pitching an idea or pitching a product, but identifying the opportunities within existing systems for leveraging change, for developing solutions. It's my honor to introduce our distinguished panel of judges. Becky Komarick is Assistant Director of the Idea Forge, the campus design and prototyping facility. She is the advisor of the Design for America student group and does research on leadership development in engineering education. Wisdom Amuzu graduated from CU Boulder. After college, Wisdom was awarded the 2015 Sue Lehman Teaching and Learning Award. In 2017, he was a Camelback Ventures Fellow and winner of the Teach for America Social Innovation Award. Wisdom currently serves as Executive Director of Empower Community High School, an innovative student-led high school in Aurora, Colorado. Chris Gustafson oversees CU Boulder's innovation and entrepreneurial ecosystem, acting as the conductor who helps to connect the dots among CU departments, students, and the community. She inspires, creates, and drives campus programs to establish CU Boulder as the innovative university. Chris's position is part of the Research and Innovation Office, which catalyzes and supports research operations, grows cross-disciplinary collaborations, and cultivates research partnerships with other universities and startup communities. Chris is the director of CU Boulder's Innovation and Entrepreneurship Initiative that operates out of the university's Research and Innovation Office. Thank you, judges, for your generous contributions to tonight's event. Now, ordinarily, the winners of each campus's Map the System competition are flown to Oxford, England, where they participate in the global competition. Unfortunately, during the 2 years CU Boulder has been involved in the Map the System contest, last year and this one, it has not been possible to fly the winner to Oxford due to the pandemic. Instead, the winner had to participate remotely. This has taken away a major incentive for entering the contest these past 2 years, but it's also meant that those students who do enter tend to be especially passionate about their projects, which I think you will discover is the case with tonight's contestants. And as this clip suggests, despite the fact the pandemic prevented last year's winner from going to Oxford and competing in person, it was nonetheless a highly rewarding experience.
Hey everyone, my name is Carla and I was the Map the System competition winner for this year for the Boulder campus. And I just wanted to make a quick video about my experience, the things that I learned, and kind of what I got out of partaking in that experience. So as I mentioned, my name is Carla. I'm currently a senior studying integrative physiology and also doing 2 certificate programs. So one in public health and another one in care, health, and resilience. So I took the Suffering and Parent Society class last fall, 2019. And that's where I first heard about Map the System. That was my first time hearing about it. And initially, I'll be honest, I was not planning on applying or partaking in the competition. But I think that as I continue to develop my final project for the course, I continue to gain an interest in what I was researching and working on. And I think Dr. Grant really gives you all of the tools to have everything that you need for the competition. So by the time you finish the course, you have already satisfied pretty much all of the requirements for the competition. So there really was nothing to lose. And I was like, you know what, if I'm gonna do my project for this course, I might as well just submit to this competition as well. And that almost kind of motivated me a little bit more. And another thing that I think caught my interest about the competition is that it's really unique in that it really encourages students from all over the world to write about and research a problem or a social issue that they're passionate about. And for me, that offered a great opportunity to develop my interests and what am I really passionate about, what kind of ignites like a fire inside of me, and what do I want to study. And so I really feel like this competition was an amazing way for me and for many other students to develop their own interests, whether that be outside of their major, outside of whatever they're studying, or even if it's beyond graduation. So those were my thoughts with entering the competition. So my project was about type 2 diabetes in Latinx communities here in the United States. So I have always been really interested in health disparities and why certain communities are disproportionately impacted, particularly with chronic diseases. And I think chronic diseases are a really complex issue because they are impacted by so many different lifestyle factors, even before you step foot in the clinic. And so I was really looking to see, why do we see the outcomes that we see today, and how can we address some of those gaps to create a sustainable long-term change? And I think that this competition really showed me that even outside of health disparities, so many different areas, I guess sectors of study and fields of work have complex issues that they're trying to address. And it can be, I would say, intimidating if you kind of look at a problem and you think, well, this is impacting it, and then this impacts this, and this is intertwined with this. And it can get really complex really quickly. And this competition and this thought process, I think, really kind of helps me and other students who partake. It introduces them to systems thinking. For me personally, I think it challenged me to take a step back, take a look. I really hope that you don't hear the background noise, but it really challenged me to take a step back, take a look at the broader perspective, and see the entirety of the systems at work. It really almost makes it easy for somebody to map out the system, right? And identify the greatest areas and opportunities to make an efficient change. So for my project, I learned a lot about why certain organizations, why they were doing well and why some weren't, which ones were good at addressing some of these outcomes and which ones weren't. So I don't think that that's something that I would have ever learned, or a skill that I would have ever learned outside of this competition. And I think that, beside that point, it was really inspiring for me to see how, as college students, we are in a really unique position where we can apply the education we're obtaining, take that and apply it to a topic or an issue that we're passionate about, and we can become advocates for it, and we can advocate for communities or for changing a system or bettering the environment around us. And I think that it was, as I mentioned, really inspiring for me to see that you can kind of pick up the tools around you and apply them to an issue and try, as cheesy as it sounds, try to make the world a little bit of a better place and become, the next generation of leaders. And I don't know if I would have ever felt like that before this competition. And even beyond my own experiences or the things that I got out of it, for me personally, partaking in the global final, which was in Oxford, well, for me, it was a little bit of a unique experience because I did have to do it virtually. But I still got the chance to connect with so many students from around the world. I actually still keep up with a lot of them, and as well as the judges who are incredibly well practiced and leaders in their fields. You get the chance to connect with all of them. And I clicked with one of the judges who continues to, I would say, mentor me with my project moving forward. So even though I'm done, I still haven't left the project. It's something that I really kind of gained a passion in. And you kind of I never saw these opportunities come out of my experience. And so, additionally with that, as I was doing my research to submit it here in Boulder, I was reaching out to a lot of local clinics and asking them, what works for you, what doesn't, what is the most efficient technique or implementation that you found with type 2 diabetes. And one of the clinics, I think, saw a big interest for me in what I was studying, and they offered me a position on their community leadership board, which is something that I continue to keep up with now, and was another opportunity that I never imagined to get out of this experience. So, as I mentioned before, this experience and taking part in the competition offered me so many more opportunities than I would have ever thought I would get from this experience. And so that's why I really wanted to make this video, to encourage all of you to apply and really make this more than just an assignment. I think that's for me what was the greatest thing that I got out of it as well, is that I feel so much more developed in my passions and how I can pursue them and my next steps. And so ultimately, I would say that this was my most impactful experience of my undergraduate degree. So I am pretty passionate too about this competition because of what it can offer students. And I really hope you guys can all apply. Thank you for listening to my experience and my story with this. And I hope I didn't ramble too much, but at the end of the day, I highly, highly encourage all of you guys to make the most of this project and this experience, because you never know what you can get out of it. So wish you all the best with the semester and the project. And again, thank you so much for listening to me. Hope you guys all have a great day. Bye.
Okay, so that was last
Hey,
year's
everyone. My
CU Boulder Map the System winner, Carla Cruz. When I was introducing the judges a few minutes ago, we were having some technical difficulties and I wasn't able to show their picture. So I'd like to do that now. This is Becky Komarek. This is Wisdom Amuzu. Wisdom, to my knowledge, has not yet arrived, but we'll trust that he comes sometime soon. And Chris Gustafsson. Okay. All right, so the remainder of our session tonight will be organized as follows. I will introduce each student and show a 5-minute video each has prepared that summarizes their research findings. There will then be a brief Q&A session between the judges and the students. We'll also give you, the audience, an opportunity to ask students a question or two through the YouTube chat. We invite you to share if you are a CU student and to share the locations you are joining us from. After all the student presentations, there will be a 5-minute intermission, during which time the judges will deliberate. When they return, the judges will announce the winner. Okay, so let's get started here. Our first contestant is Audrey Curtis. She is a senior in biochemistry and molecular, cellular, and developmental biology at the University of Colorado Boulder. She's also pursuing the Care, Health, and Resilience certificate. She chose to do her paper about disparities in genetic counseling because lessening the gap in who receives healthcare of all kinds is essential in portraying the ideals that she wants her generation to bring to and reinforce in the United States. She hopes to be a genetic counselor one day and continue to bring new ideas and solutions to this problem firsthand. Here, Audrey describes her project on the disproportionate use of genetic therapies in minority populations.
Hi, my name is Audrey Curtis, and I am a biochemistry and molecular, cellular, and developmental biology major at the University of Colorado Boulder. I focused my Map the System paper on the disproportionate use of genetic therapies in minority populations in the United States. To begin with, I would like to go over some definitions. Genetic therapy includes 2 parts: genetic testing and genetic counseling. Genetic testing is the process of screening someone's genes for specific mutations that could lead to a disease, such as a BRCA mutation may lead to breast and ovarian cancer. Genetic counseling takes place when a professional who is trained in both genetics and counseling meets with their patient to go over the results of the genetic test. In a patient with a family history of breast cancer who displays a BRCA mutation, this patient could take preventative steps towards her diagnosis before actually developing breast cancer. This counseling piece is also very important because doctors without genetic training may not be able to read the results of the genetic test accurately, which can lead to unneeded surgeries or treatments. The next definition that we need to discuss is an inherited disease. An inherited disease comes from a mutation passed down by one or both parents, so it affects their offspring. This can come in one of 2 forms. It may be a dominant disease or a recessive disease. There are 2 subgroups of a recessive disease. A carrier has one mutated allele and does not show the disease phenotype, while a person with 2 mutated alleles will be afflicted with that disease. This distinction between being a carrier or being a diseased individual comes into play when we look at the history of sickle cell disease in the African American community, which demonstrates an important problem with genetic counseling in minority communities, mainly that genetic information has long been used as a form of discrimination. This case study walks us through some of the abuses of the past. In 1910, scientists discovered sickle cell disease. Its main defining feature is that a person who has this disease has a sickle cell-shaped red blood cell. Occasionally, these cells may clump together and block blood vessels, causing a very painful outcome. This is called a sickle cell crisis. In 1920, sickle cell disease became labeled as a disease that only affected African Americans and therefore had a stigma attached. By the 1950s, genetic counselors began to tell African Americans to have abortions so that they wouldn't have offspring who had sickle cell disease. In the 1960s, employers began to make African American employees have genetic tests under a pretense of protection, as to not bring on a sickle cell crisis. However, this just led to employment discrimination in areas such as the Air Force Academy and airlines. The culmination of this history happened in 1972 when millions of African Americans were forced to get genetic screenings done, and then they were all told they had sickle cell disease. This was because the genetic test that was used did not discriminate between carriers of the disease and afflicted individuals. All of the patients were told their diagnosis, given a pamphlet, and told to leave. These atrocities were called the genocide by African Americans because they were told to have abortions, not to have children, and not to form families with other African Americans. This case study is important in identifying the challenges of evening out the use of genetic therapies by minority populations. There is widespread fear and mistrust of the government and government-controlled institutions like medicine and pharmaceuticals. Some ways this has been addressed is through HIPAA and GINA laws, which protect genetic and health information from being used as a source of discrimination. Another solution that was used to try and rebuild the trust between minority communities and scientists was the Partnership to Understand and Eliminate Disparate Outcomes, partnered with Mexican American women to look at their genetics. In teaming up with the community, they were able to help the women learn about their own genetics and ways to prevent and treat disease, but also able to see the nuances of how different minority communities communicate with and understand health professionals. The gaps in this are that the medical institution does not take racial bias seriously enough. There should be a committee created by and for minorities that collect complaints and dictate how best to handle racial situations. Whether this means providing education for physicians or maintaining a 3-strike punishment program before the doctor has his medical license revoked. This solution is one that is attainable without having to dismantle all the institutions that exist in America today. It is important to understand how the widespread fear and mistrust of the government and medical institutions informs how minority populations may feel about the COVID-19 vaccine. The African American population has one of the lowest vaccination rates among populations, which makes sense considering the long-standing abuse and neglect they have faced at the hands of the medical institution. This is why it's even more important for us to try and reconcile the issues of the past so that we can save millions of lives with vaccinations as well as genetic therapies.
Okay, well, thank you, Audrey. And now I'll turn it over to the judges who have some questions for Audrey about her project.
Okay, I'll kick us off. Don, do you want us just to jump in as we go, or should we be raising hands?
Just fire away.
Okay, and just a quick process question. Would you like our feedback after questions or kind of all at one time?
I'll let the conversation go on for about 5 or 7 minutes, and then we'll move on to let the audience ask some questions. So either way is fine.
Okay, great. I'll jump in. So Audrey, awesome submission, really insightful. I learned a lot by looking at your submission, and I can see that you've got a lot of passion behind the topic. I think it's really interesting, the case study that you provided with sickle cell and the subsequent reactions. I wondered if you had put any research into the access to care in terms of cost and resources for minority populations. You spent a lot of time, which was great, on, you know, sort of medical practitioners' point of view and some of their lack of resources, but I wondered if you did any research on actually the population's lack of access to medical care.
Yeah, so I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions about genetic counseling as well, is that there are Medicaid and Medicare do cover some forms of genetic testing, but I think that more education needs to be put into it on both the doctor level and just informing their patients that it is something that exists and can benefit them.
Other questions for Audrey?
Yeah, hi, Audrey. Thank you for sharing all of your work. You educated me immensely. I knew of, healthcare disparities to some extent, but it was really great to get such a detailed perspective. And so one of the consequences that you propose for doctors who say show bias or, are, kind of like the punishment, you talk about revoking licenses. And I'm wondering if you have any opinions about what, say, medical schools or what like that initial licensing body can do to try to help in the first place.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think that one thing that could be implemented is having courses that teach doctors before they become doctors of like the history of the prejudice and discrimination that has happened, so that doctors can firsthand acknowledge them and then be able to act appropriately and understand where the hesitation is coming from and try on a personal level to just make it easier for them to be trusted. And I think there was one study that I read about that was really interesting to me. It's that one thing that showed patients trusting doctors more wasn't being the same race, but it was interpersonal competence and technical competence. And one of the things is like just the doctor saying hi, spending time with the patients, and not just like quickly just diagnosing them and leaving, but actually spending time with the patient and making sure that their needs are being met.
Thank you.
Good morning, Audrey. Well, it's not morning, but what time is it? Good 5:27 p.m. to you, Audrey. One follow-up question for you. What role does race and racism play in the challenge and solution that you explored and proposed?
That's a good question. I think that racism obviously exists still and still a big problem, but a lot of people, I feel like, don't always acknowledge it as still being an issue that persists in America today. So I think that in the medical field, it needs to be acknowledged more, and we need to, I don't really know, that's always been a tough one for me, how to address it in the right way and be an effective ally. So yeah, I don't know if I have a very good answer for that one. It's a good question.
One follow-up question to your answer to Rebecca. You mentioned interpersonal skills as literally triggered memory I have with doctors. And quite often the difference in how they make you feel when you enter their rooms. Curious, as you look at the solutions you propose, what, if any, recommendations would you make to increase doctors' interpersonal intimacy skills?
I think that one thing that could definitely help is lessening the doctor's workloads, because I feel like a lot of the time they're just running from patient to patient, which isn't good for anyone. So I think that, and I think that that's a totally plausible thing, is to have doctors with less patients so that they can actually focus on the care that they're giving. And then interpersonal skills, I think, should just be something that doctors should have, whether they need to practice or take classes on it. I think that it just shows a form of empathy that all patients should receive.
Thanks, Wisdom. And Audrey, I'd love to jump in with another question or just a comment related to that, the practitioner's capacity. I think that your argument and the submission could really be strengthened by talking a little more about capacity just in general. That's a super relevant point because the system is so strained right now, minority or otherwise, with care. So I think that'd be really interesting to pull some data out there. And then a question for you, and this is an easier one to answer. What got you into this subject? Why are you so passionate about it?
So I actually started with, I saw a genetic counselor come in at CU in one of my classes, and I really liked what he was doing. And then when I was shadowing him, he actually was talking to me about the racial disparities in genetic counseling. And then he gave me a book to read, and he talked to me a little bit about like what he's trying to do to combat the problem. And that really got me interested in learning about this and trying to figure out different ways to, or different solutions.
It's great. And I want to commend you also in your video. You had a really good framing of definitions. I think in your map the system or your systems diagram too, that was really helpful. And I think I learned something I might have learned years ago. I forgot all those definitions. So I think that was really helpful as you made it more on the layman's level, and how we can relate to it. So great job.
Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you, Audrey. Now we'll open it up to the audience. Do any of our viewers have questions for Audrey? Anybody? We have several moving parts here. So Katie, if there are questions, let me know. I can't see all the screens here. All right. Okay. So there are no questions yet from the audience. So we'll stop there and thank Audrey for her presentation and her responses to the judges. Thanks so much, Audrey.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so let me try to get back on share screen here. Okay, so our next contestant is Taylor Hershberg. He is a sociology major with years of experience developing creative and strategic solutions in several sectors, including NGOs, public health, project development, advocacy, and education. He has worked on projects worldwide in places like the United States, Europe, Brazil, and the Middle East. In addition, Taylor is a published author and freelance journalist who writes on global issues that impact the LGBTQIA+ community. You can find his work in magazines like Out and The Advocate. His current research is on the mental health impacts of climate change on children, the impacts of nature exposure on people living with HIV, and planetary health. This fall, Taylor will be attending Columbia University, where he will be working towards his doctorate in public health. In this clip, Taylor describes his work on supporting children who experience climate grief.
Hello, everyone. My name is Taylor Hershberg. Thank you so much for considering me for this contest. It's an honor. All right, so let me tell you a little bit about my visual map here. So over here in the red box on the left, you've got direct climate impact. So things that actually are happening in the environment because of climate change. So you've got rising temperatures, flooding, drought, mass extinction, extreme weather events. So in my literature review, which you'll also see in my paper, I went and found out what I think is the most profound outcomes of these different weather or climate change events. So with rising temperatures, there will be an increase in crime. You'll see that evidence that I found 60,000 You've got mass extinction. This is based on my research actually of climate grief in children when I spoke to adults and their adolescent children. And these are feelings that they had related to mass extinction. And then you also have extreme weather events. So Dr. Lori Peak did a lot of work on this at the sociology department, and it causes PTSD. Now, a lot of these will involve some of the other, so each of these can cause any one of these indirect climate impacts. So all of this is sort of keeping climate grief in children. So, and having it being unaddressed, and that's the reason why there's a gap there. So now you have some social determinants, right? So this is complicating things. So with mental health, there's a great stigma on mental health. And so when you're having this profound outcomes of mental health from direct climate changes, this contributes. Then you have capitalism. So capitalism is a system in which we're all in that actually exacerbates climate change. So ourselves as individuals that live within capitalism and the institutes that cause it, we're all living in the same experience. And it goes to exacerbate climate grief in children because it's a system we're sort of stuck in. And then there's denial. So there's all sorts of denial that this can refer to. It can be climate change denial. It can be denial of these feelings. So this becomes even more complicated, right? So these are like some really big ideological ideas that for me, or ideas and frameworks and issues that really are sort of the core of social determinants that really impact climate grief in children and a lack of attention and care to it. So then you have some other social determinants. Now these are impacts on research, right? Why there's no research on it to help these kids to figure out interventions, causes, to look at ways of support that are evidence-based. So you've got a lack of funding, right? So when you've got all of these direct and indirect climate issues, and then you've got these larger social determinant issues, then the subcategory of lack of funding, you don't get much support in research. So there you've got lack of support. So you don't have enough people wanting to do the research on it. You don't have enough funding for it. And then you've got bad policy, right? So you've got bad policy, of course, changes with each presidential administration. You've got policy that favors capitalism. You've got money not going into mental health care. So when you combine all these things, you have little research that's being done. And with that little research, then you have climate grief in children, and you have it being unaddressed. So what I learned from this is that after interviewing several kids and their parents, I learned that this is pretty serious and that children don't necessarily recognize it as grief, but they are experiencing distress, and that many of their parents don't quite understand the depth of it. This is definitely something that needs to be addressed because it builds resilience, it builds hope, which ultimately equals into action to prevent the continued impacts of climate change. Thank you so much.
All right, well, thank you, Taylor. Now I'll turn to the judges.
Hi, Taylor.
Hi there.
I just want to say thank you for your submission. I mean, like I said in the last one, I learned a lot. It seems like you are kind of, in terms of researching this, you're on the earlier phases since there doesn't seem to be that much out there right now already. So, I mean, props to you for that. So I have a question that I have from reading your submission. So you mentioned that there's no clinical diagnosis for climate grief yet. And when you talked about it, it sounded like there were positives and negatives of doing that. So I'm kind of curious if you could expand upon that a little bit. And would it be beneficial to have a clinical diagnosis?
So that's a great question. Rebecca. So the question you're asking me is, you said that I did not state that there was a clinical diagnosis and whether there would be a benefit or lack of benefit for that, because I argued both sides. So pathologizing, I think anything is really important to creating evidence-based measures that can, or best practices that can support individuals. However, in my research, I learned that using a pathologized term like climate grief actually acted as a deterrent to recruitment. So people felt like it was too strong of a word. However, in my qualitative evidence that I built in these interviews, I had a pretty profound statement that one of the young adolescents had to say that, to quote them specifically, when my mother told me about this study, I was surprised because I don't feel like I'm feeling grief, but the more I think about it, I'm profoundly sad. So I do think that pathologizing it is good, but we need to take a deeper look into the words and their meanings and coupling those to what climate grief is, and then using that as a method then to expand intervention-based research.
Okay, awesome, thank you.
Hi, Taylor.
I was
trying to synthesize this into one question and not 6 questions, which is not going to be helpful. Help me out. There's one part I'm struggling with, and it's the no research part. Can you add some clarity for me in terms of, you're referring specifically to research about, well, actually, let me be quiet. When you say no research, can you be a little bit more specific?
Yes, I'm more than happy to. So the research that's currently being done is specific to climate anxiety or to certain other types of distress. There isn't any research that takes a look at grief. But when you start to take a look at extreme weather events and some of these other events that I mentioned that are related to climate change, a lot of the emotional responses that are being verbalized can lend themselves to 3 different types of grief: anticipatory grief, bereavement-like grief, and transitional grief. And that's not really being put into the framework for studying what this is. However, all these things match a lot of the behavioral outcomes that come with that. Great questions.
I'll pass. Chris.
Okay, yeah, good questions. Taylor, awesome job. Really, really interesting submission. And as a parent, I can completely relate, because I think that notion of denial is very prevalent. And parents, adults, we're experiencing this anxiety, and we really don't know how to talk about it to our kids. And often it is denial that comes into play because we just don't have the answers. So I think this is a really thought-provoking topic. I wanted to ask you, in follow-up to Wisdom's notion and what you've said about a lack of supporting research, which is hard. You mentioned that falling in love with nature was a solution for children to work through this. Can you just talk a little bit about that, like what you've seen being implemented and why you think that's a great solution?
Yeah, so there is some research that works specifically with adults, and actually in my research for this as well, and I used a validated scale. It's called the Connected to Natureness scale. It was created by 3 scientists that were wanting to look at the cognitive and experiential factors of a person's relatedness with nature. And those that score higher, which is a score of 5, means that they're more connected to nature and they rely on it. And those that score lower are, of course, they're not. And self-reporting from people in the research of the people that did that scale, and also in mine, that self-reported having depression had lower NR relative scores. So their nature relatedness scores were much lower, whereas those that had higher did not report having depression, et cetera. In my specific study, one of the adolescents that reported having depression related to climate loss or climate change and the losses associated with it was on an antidepressant, she had the lowest scores out of the whole entire sample.
Really interesting answer. And what I would say, because I have a feeling you're going to dig more into this area, it's super compelling. What I would recommend, and I saw this in your submission, I think you also started to articulate some of the environmental impact, obviously, of climate change. I would really focus your argument on the depression and grief impact, because I think there's so much to discover there, and it might be less distracting in your argument if you can hone in just on the depression and grief, knowing that a lot of other people, of course, are working on, the other side of the equation, but I think that could really strengthen what you do going forward. Good job.
Thank you very much.
Other questions from the judges? Any questions from the audience?
One question, just one question. Here's how you take this, Taylor. Lots of ways you can take this. Could you answer the so what question for your challenge and solution? And in an idealistic future, let's call it, I don't know, 2045. Lots of magic happens over the next few decades. What is possible if we've figured out a solution? What is possible?
So the solution in regards to supporting children of climate grief, climate change, what specifically?
Sounds like from your argument, supporting children with climate grief.
Yeah, so that's a great question. Supporting children that have climate grief, say we solve that. I don't think it's ever something we can solve, because emotions are not rational beings. However, we can are irrational. However, we can come up with rational solutions to help that out. What I believe is sort of with anything that we do in life, as a group, as individuals, that over time we become better and we learn to cope with these irrational feelings. We learn to cope with what's going on in our surroundings, and we tend to make things better around ourselves, around our humanity, and around our future. So I think when you are able to take someone out of, I guess their HP axis and bring it to their frontal lobe and be like, hey, let someone think about what's happening and let them see what's going forward, you're going to be building more resilient individuals that can cope with more tragedies that come with climate change, and perhaps even other tragedies that are, come with the connection to nature, the conflicts that come from that, et cetera. Thank you for your question.
Thank you. Any more questions for Taylor? Well, Taylor, thank you so much. Thank you. All right, so thank you, Taylor. Next is Tyler Strobel. Tyler is a first-year law student at the University of Colorado Law School. Tyler got his BA in Classics from Bucknell University, then studied marine science through a Cambridge program in Malaysia when the pandemic started. He is interested in the intersections between business and law, especially pertaining to environmental and health innovations and infrastructures. Here, Tyler discusses his project on the adolescent e-cigarette crisis in the United States.
Hello, my name is Tyler Strobel, and I'm a law student at CU Boulder. I researched the rise of e-cigarette use among adolescents and their associated nicotine addiction for the Map the System competition. I chose this topic because nicotine-related deaths were the highest form of preventable deaths in the US in 2019, more than murder, suicide, gun violence, car accidents, and AIDS combined. The rising rates of adolescent nicotine addiction pose a serious risk of social and health issues in the coming decades. In this video and in my paper, I refer to e-cigarettes as electronic nicotine delivery systems, or ENDS. This broad label includes vapes, vape pens, hookah pens, tank systems, cigarettes, cigalikes, and other electronic non-combustible nicotine products. ENDS aerosolize electronic liquid called e-liquid into a nicotine or other substance-rich vapor. ENDS were created in 2003. By 2018, there was a 900% increase in ENDS use among US adolescents, and 1 in 4 high school students and 1 in 10 middle school students were regularly using ENDS. In 2018, the CDC, in conjunction with the FDA and the NIH, declared that adolescent ENDS use had reached epidemic proportions and classified adolescent ENDS use as an adolescent public health crisis. This paper and visual map explores the roles ENDS companies played in this crisis. While I reference Juul Labs in both the paper and the map, they're not the only company at fault, simply the largest and most popular, accounting for between 60 and 75% of the ENDS market share by 2020. First, ENDS manufacturers intentionally advertise to at-risk populations such as adolescents. For example, Juul created educational curricula saying that vaping was healthier and safer than smoking and paid schools to teach that. Further, the prevalence of dessert flavors, bright colors, and young models led to several investigations into Juul and other ENDS manufacturers' advertising practices. These investigations resulted in several congressional hearings and lawsuits, which found that ENDS manufacturers intentionally advertised to children. In those congressional hearings, it was also found that ENDS manufacturers intentionally targeted Black and tribal communities, selling products and e-liquids for substantially less than in other areas. These practices perpetuated Big Tobacco's targeting of minor and tribal communities. Second, ENDS are designed for addiction. Vaping is less abrasive than smoking and easier to begin. The market is saturated with candy and dessert flavors, which target children, particularly as non-clove or menthol flavored cigarettes are already prohibited in the US. Further, e-liquid is substantially stronger than normal cigarettes, with each dose containing more nicotine than a single cigarette. ENDS manufacturers also profited off of rampant misinformation and misconceptions surrounding ENDS use. Many believe that adolescent self-reporting of ENDS use is underreported given the pervasive belief that not all Juul products contain nicotine. Many ENDS manufacturers have been sued or have pending lawsuits for violating FDA regulations by saying that vaping is a smoking cessation strategy, despite the FDA's refusal to affirm this claim. Vaping might seem harmless, but it actually causes an increase in mental health concerns, especially among adolescents. Addictions, especially at young ages, disrupt healthy brain development by interfering with pathway formations of norepinephrine and other neurotransmitters. The result is an increased risk of lifetime mood disorders, anxiety, depression, and substance abuse. ENDS use disproportionately affects disadvantaged populations who are already struggling under socioeconomic inequalities and the effects of COVID-19. As I mentioned before, Black and tribal communities have been targeted by ENDS advertising and misinformation campaigns. Worse, many tribal, rural, and disadvantaged urban communities face food insecurity, which nicotine use exacerbates. There's a dose-response relationship between nicotine and food insecurity, meaning that food insecure people are more likely to start using nicotine products and to stay food insecure as a result than food secure people. So how do we combat this issue? It's messy. The US federal government increased the smoking age to 21, but has been otherwise slow to respond. Every state has passed regulations on ENDS use, sale, and possession, and 19 states have classified ENDS as tobacco. There are also many media campaigns targeting adolescent ENDS use, including the FDA's The Real Cost. However, the most effective method will be local community responses based in educating the public. If the misinformation around adolescent ENDS use and adolescent vaping continues, the rates of adolescent vaping will only rise, particularly during and following the COVID-19 pandemic.
Okay, thank you, Tyler. Judges.
I'll jump in. Really interesting insights here as well. You did an impressive amount of research, Tyler. I mean, I think it was pages and pages in your bibliography, and it's a lot of good sources and representation of different research bodies. I'm curious to know if you researched other countries and how they're managing ENDS and what insights you may have learned from that and how the US can apply some of those practices.
I did not research other countries directly.
I initially wanted to have a more narrow scope of a project, but realized that I needed to broaden it to the full US. And I feared that broadening it beyond the US would lead to contradicting information and that type of thing. I have encountered accounts in my research. I know that Australia has similar concerns. They've been a little bit stricter. I think that Australia has classified nicotine containing e-liquid as tobacco. And basically what that means is that if a substance that's not tobacco directly is classified as tobacco, you can apply all the existing legislation and laws that refer to tobacco to nicotine and other like e-cigarette products. So I know that they're a little bit ahead. I think the UK is a little bit behind just because they definitely have they have a longer of a history of tobacco use than the US, although the US is very, there's a very rich tradition and history with tobacco use and tobacco growing and nicotine consumption in the US. There's a much longer tradition in the UK, and there's been much more resistance to regulating ends use and consumption and sale and distribution in any quantitative way. But I didn't look beyond the US for fear of making the research too convoluted.
Well, yeah, and you've already listed a few other examples which sound great, and I commend you on taking all the research that you cited in your bibliography and coming up with your cohesive argument. I think that's really hard to do, and you did a great job crystallizing that.
Thank you.
I'll agree with Chris's comments. This was an amazing amount of research, very clearly written and cited, so I commend you for that. My questions are about these different groups that you say are disproportionately affected. So such as homeless, veterans experiencing homelessness, Native Americans and tribal communities, food secure individuals. What have you explored related to the cultures or these typical situations in communities that they live in that make ends use much more prevalent and makes these communities more susceptible to all of these problems beyond, targeted marketing, obviously, but I guess I'm talking about the communities in themselves, what is happening there?
Yeah, of course. Thank you so much for that question. To speak bluntly, a lot of the communities that are already disadvantaged and are historically and traditionally disadvantaged in the United States experience higher rates of anxiety and depression and substance abuse as a result of the disadvantagement. There were, to take the tribal nations, for example, specifically the Midwest tribal nations, the Lakota, the Sioux, the Ojibwe, the Creeks, etc. Beyond the normal stresses of being occupied and pushed out of their land and having constant wars waged for 200 years, there's a higher level of substance abuse and alcoholism and opioid use and opioid addiction. And while the US government is finally starting to funnel resources into those areas, there's less of a cultural response historically that towards preventing these addictions than in other areas, if that makes sense. Less resources, less awareness, less prioritization, I guess, if you want to go that far. In terms of homelessness is there's a decent amount of research. I haven't fully gone into this, so I apologize if I overspeak. Between homelessness and substance abuse, just based off of substance abuse, people who engage in substance abuse are more likely to become homeless than people who don't, and people who are already homeless are more likely to engage in substances that alleviate the tensions and stressors of their life. And then in terms of the Black community, as I mentioned, other than being targeted and other than historic and systemic racism, I would attribute it mostly to Big Tobacco's targeting of Black communities with selling menthol cigarettes for approximately 15% of a normal cigarette in a white community throughout the late 1800s and early 1900s as a way of
creating a dependent and addicted population as the primary form of primary cause of the issues that we're seeing today.
So, as isn't surprising, exceptionally complex. Thank you.
Two questions for you, Tyler. So the first is sort of a follow-up to the question that was asked in your answer. It's the how do you know question for the cultural, I'm talking about, I've got Midwest tribal reservation. How do you know what cultural strengths and or, I don't want to say weaknesses, really. Sure, you could say deficiencies. How do you know how that's contributing to the problem?
It's a dangerous game to play. I admit that I'm definitely on the knife's edge of analyzing a culture from the outside. I have connections to the Midwest. I was raised there. I have family. I'm more familiar with the trials and tribulations of the Métis, which are like a mestizo mixed race people in northern Minnesota. But it's generally just research. There's research that's been done about substance use in these communities, and I'm relying upon that. The proof for targeting the Lumi and the Cheyenne River Sioux that I mentioned in my paper was because one of the chiefs came in and testified before Congress. So I took their words and applied them to my case. So while I did not necessarily cite that with Rebecca's question, I'm taking what I've read and applying it to the situation. And like as a white person, I can't necessarily know 100%, but I can make the educated connections that I see. So it's definitely a very complicated issue, and I'm very hesitant to say like substance abuse exists because of a cultural deficiency or something like that. It's not that simple. You can't. One of the reasons why I didn't want to expand the project scope so drastically is because it's so complicated, and providing a broad stroke understanding of the issues that are that contribute to adolescent nicotine addiction is a much, I guess to be candid, it's a safer approach than to go into the intricacies of a community that isn't necessarily mine, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Of course. Did that answer both of your questions, or is that just?
To me, you went into the funk of things, so I appreciate your bravery.
Of course.
And thank you. And when we talk about systems mapping, we set boundaries of what's included and what's not included. And so I think that factors into your analysis as well.
Yes, thank you.
Any more questions from the judges? Well, if not, thank you, Tyler. Thank you so much. All right, so our final contestant is Tamana Talwar. She is a senior at CU Boulder and is obtaining a degree in biochemistry along with a minor in sociology. This fall, she will be entering CU Anschutz, where she will be pursuing a doctorate in pharmacy, and hopes to learn more about ways she can integrate the worlds of pharmacy and global health to address health disparities within the United States. Here, Tamana describes her project on bridging the gap on autism and diagnosis. Try it again here.
Hi, my name is Tamana Talwar, and I'm a student at the University of Colorado Boulder. And the topic that I'll be presenting today is bridging the gap on autism and diagnosis. In the next few minutes, I'll be walking you through different components of the presentation, which explore the different disparities both on individual and infrastructure levels that contribute to the current gap of diagnosis. Autism spectrum disorder is classified as a neurobehavioral syndrome impacting around 1 out of 54 children in the United States alone. Considered a spectrum disorder, symptoms vary, yet general patterns include significant social, communication, and behavioral impairments. Since the early 2000s, the CDC started to track the prevalence of ASD, and rates have increased from 0.67 to 1.85%. Yet this rate does not reflect across all demographics. Autism and Development Disability Monitoring, ADDM, reports having consistently noted that more white children are identified with ASD than Black or Hispanic children. Differences suggest that Black and Hispanic children may face socioeconomic and/or additional barriers that lead to a lack of delayed access towards evaluation, diagnosis, and services. There is no biological reason for autism prevalence to differ across racial and ethnic groups. Despite the unknown reason for what causes ASD to occur, research have concluded that there is no specific root, but the system itself that propagates differences in prevalence across the board. The following is the problem landscape and how the diagnosis gap is embedded across diverse institutions and reinforce their different models in the US. The iceberg model was broken down to indicate both visible issues as well as hidden problems that perpetuate the lack of access to early diagnostic services and intervention for families of lower socioeconomic status, minority, and non-English speaking backgrounds. Embedded in the visual map, I have added some data in which I collected through an anonymous survey asking parents and guardians about their own experiences regarding initial diagnosis and follow-up intervention services. Collecting over 60 plus responses through different Autism Speak support groups, I was able to get an insight as to how families deal with the emotional and physical roller coaster and whether support was accessible or not. The current root causes that exacerbate the diagnosis gap are presented as a causal loop. Starting off, current screenings are prominent tools used to diagnose ASD. However, they've been designed in a way that does not as accurately diagnose for children of color, low income, and non-English speaking backgrounds. Following within the medical realms, providers often lack the resources, capacity, and mandate to equitably disseminate information to underrepresented groups. Health infrastructures are set up in a way which excludes non-English speaking families from receiving the same efficient care. Additionally, families living in rural and/or urban poor areas have a harder time accessing and attending frequent trips to specialized healthcare facilities where services are conducted. This ties in with SES status, as studies show that families of lower economic brackets face daily hurdles which propagate the irregular access to general health care. Furthermore, families of lower SES backgrounds have fewer available sources to educate themselves about the disorder. Along with the lack of access, ASD is considered highly stigmatized in many cultures, which not only make it difficult to seek help, but often delays acceptance of the child's diagnosis. Awareness also contributes towards the gap, as decreased reports of autism are common among lower SES families due to unfamiliarity of signs and further stigma perpetuated by healthcare providers to misdiagnose their child with conduct disorder and oppositional defiant disorder before an ASD diagnosis, demonstrating how each of these factors contribute to the failure of accessible and equitable services across all demographics. Here I use an impacts gap canvas to evaluate the different sectors. One example that was identified was the disconnect between different stakeholders and how that can be used as an advantage to increase awareness of ASD within the rural and urban poor regions. Collaborations with schools along with CDC can enhance knowledge and information about ASD and provide a step towards decreasing the gap of diagnosis. Another pivotal gap that was to be addressed was the societal stigma surrounding ASD. Current bias contributes to delayed efforts towards critical intervention, which has been proven to be effective in improving IQ, behavioral skills, language, and communication ability. Overall, providing equitable access can contribute towards developing a child's full potential and adapting to life. Overall, frameworks of access must be holistic. These include changes of collaboration between federal programs and schools to tackle issues of delayed access among vulnerable populations and improving healthcare services to be more comprehensive. The start for change includes increasing awareness and destigmatizing ASD through everyday conversations and educating both families and the public on how institutional discrimination impacts the diagnosis gap. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Tamana. Judges?
Hi, Tamana. Thank you so much for sharing your presentation today. I definitely enjoyed reading it, and I'm curious, of all of the things that you studied and all the different parts of the system that are impactful in this problem, do you feel that there's any kind of like one area of problems that have a stronger impact than others in this?
Yeah, definitely, for sure. So sorry, did not mean to cut you off. But I think in the perspectives of what has been impacting is just the general lack of access for low income and rural areas to be able to see a primary care provider, and the primary care provider to be able to initiate a diagnosis on time and accurately. I think the really biggest thing is that with different types of delay, it definitely is detrimental with any type of disease, but more so with autism, it's such a big impact because personal experience with my brother being autism, I think that was such a big way of opening up my lifespan and understanding how, because he was able to get the intervention, the services from a very young age, he's able to move from a very non-communicable person to someone who's thriving and is like probably the most talkative person I know today. So it's just that lack of access and just general consistent access, and then the early diagnosis that is beneficial for individuals with ASD.
Great answer. I'd love to follow up on that, Tamara. And really, really beautiful job with your submission, very graphically appealing, and you hit a lot of amazing points. And I like to use the iceberg model with the puzzle pieces. It was very easy to understand. Access, I think it's great you hit on access to care. That's something that comes up all the time in the rural area implication. And I think you mentioned in your submission that, which is pretty insightful, that with COVID, we've seen a lot more uptick in telehealth visits and that sort of thing, which is promising for rural areas. What other interventions do you think rural areas could practice to increase this awareness?
Yeah, definitely. I think one of the other biggest thing that I was looking into was just that with rural regions, the next best aspect is primary infrastructure such as schools. That being like the next biggest connections, schools, churches, something that they have a social connection to, where they're able to get information, maybe some information about what autism is, maybe some background telltale signs, what to do, some ways to call and who to call, just so that way a child can get potentially tested if there are concerns, which not only brings this conversation of ASD into everyday conversation, but then it also then starts to destigmatize what ASD is and hopefully expands it so that more people are able to accept the aspects of ASD, and hopefully it's just more comprehensive for everyone who are of ASD, get diagnosed earlier, which is the main issue.
Those are great insights. And I would encourage you, as you further in your research path, you might look at other chronic conditions like diabetes and how rural areas have started to attack that with exactly what you said, studies related to more awareness through community hubs in areas like schools. So I think that's great. You're thinking along those lines. Good
Thank
job.
you. Yes, definitely will.
First, is it Tamana?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Curious. You spoke to this. Just curious what you had. Children of color. I forget the stat. 5.1 times.
Yes.
I forget the stat.
Yes.
You know your stats. Less likely to be diagnosed or accurately diagnosed. First, is it the tool? Is it the biases in the humans using the tool?
Yes, very good question. So I think it's actually both. There has been some studies that have indicated that a certain type of diagnostic screening, such as the MCHAT, which they have addressed recently, that it is not as effective in diagnosing for females, low income and minority backgrounds, and they are acknowledging the discrepancies of these biases with screenings. But also along with the screening aspects comes the actual provider. Like I mentioned in my presentation, sometimes there has been some biases towards diagnosing children of color with conduct disorder, oppositional defiant disorder before they are receiving an ASD diagnosis. And I think that not only is systematically oppressing these children from being able to receive the services and these critical interventions at an earlier pace, but then makes this gap much more detrimental, where children of white backgrounds are at least able to get the services earlier versus children of color, when it is delayed, and then makes it difficult for them to be able to have the same background and standing when they are entering into schools and furthermore into society.
One quick follow-up, and I work in a school. Coming to my mind is a Black mother with 2 autistic children who's in our school, who has told all sorts of stories that map across the different stats you provided, the way you mapped the problem. She comes into your office, Principal Tamala. You've done all of this. And she asks you, okay, so what am I to do? What am I to do with this 9th grade autistic child? What counsel would you offer? Just based on everything you've read.
Yeah, I think one of the biggest things that I have learned just as a sister is just the support system, and something that I would offer, whether it's just maybe the difficulty of just having someone with ASD at home, is maybe having a connection, such as maybe like for my brother, I can only speak from personal experiences. He had a support system through school and was able to have these intervention processes where he was able to go and seek additional support outside of the family and or school. So some therapy, some behavioral speaking aspects as well. As a potential principal, I would address this as just trying to provide as much as resources as I can. So doing research within the area that the parents live in, ways that I can make it accessible for them if it is not applicable with their schedule and not being able to go to all these intervention and services because there's many. Maybe finding ways to incorporate telehealth aspects now that that's become a really big thing, and just seeing different aspects to provide for a mother who has 2 autistic children, and just providing as much support as I can.